So recently this year, I graduated university with a degree in military and political history. And I decided that the best way to earn back my money from this is by turning my essays into videos. Now, recently with the Arab-Israeli conflict that is going on, I decided it would be good to turn my essay from the Arab-Israeli module into a video. The original essay was about how to what extent the British were responsible for the conflict. However, due to not wanting to be sued by the university for my unsubmitted work, I have decided to spread it to a far greater field, taking every side into account in regards to the origins of the conflict and how it all started. Also, I intend for this video to educate those and to further demonstrate how this situation is complicated to many. The historiography of the Arab-Israeli conflict has been a subject of great debate. A central narrative has focused on the policies by the British between 1916 and 1948. Historians have cited that Britain over 3 decades implemented an array of contradictory agreements, at times to appease the Arab community and other times the Jewish community. The assertion is that these policies were the catalyst to the deterioration of Arab and Jewish relations in Palestine and remain to this day. Historians such as Ingress and Schneer cite the deterioration began with the 3 conflicting wartime pledges, the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Balfour Declaration by the British between 1915 and 1917. Whilst they differ in reasons, Ingress cites imperialist duplicity and Schneer wartime desperation. This narrative is contradicted by Friedman, who argues the promises were not contradictory, created by diplomacy, politics, and individuals. A further interpretation is presented by historians Wasserstein and Shepard, who cite that decision-making during the Mandate years was simply an insolvable task in order to find a solution for 2 competing nations. Another theme of the historiography of this debate is addressed by Cohen, Lesser, and Khalidi, the role nationalism played in shaping the complex relations between the parties. Geopolitics, the creation of new powers, and the direct and indirect consequences of World War II is a perspective developed by Daphne Schneefer. Historians Kirsten E. Schultz and Avi Schleim explore the deterioration in relation to the later Mandate policy, ending in the withdrawal by the British from Palestine. Whilst it would be simple to say British policies assisted the deterioration of the Arabs and Jewish relation, in order to answer the question, there needs to be an examination on the different influences and themes, imperialisms, wars, nationalism, and geopolitics that have established the narrative of the conflict. Furthermore, how the various deals and treaties impacted on the relationship between the Arabs and the Zionists. The question is, when did the deterioration of Arab-Jewish relations begin and why? According to Doreen Ingress, the conflict began in 1917 before the end of the First World War. In her Palestine papers, 1917 to 1922, Seeds of Conflict, she cites the root of the hostilities were directly related to the 3 wartime pledges made by the British government to Arabs, French, and the Jews by 1917. Ingress states the implementation of the pledges were based on duplicity to protect Britain, the Empire, and a successful outcome in World War I. Contextualized against the backdrop of the changing political landscape of 1914, Ingress states that the Arab nationalists and the Zionist movements were pushing for new agendas. The Zionists aimed to create a Jewish state and the Arabs' freedom from foreign rule, this being the Ottoman Empire. Ingress' analysis of the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence of July 1915 to March 1916 clearly argues that in return for Arab support against the Ottoman Empire, the British government promised to support an independent Arab state in the Middle East. Furthermore, the pledge was recognized by Hussein and Arab nationalists that an Arab state would be established post-war. According to Ingress' narrative, Britain's duplicity to maintain its own interests is illustrated by the implementation of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916. The agreement that outlined the division of the Ottoman Empire between Britain and France. an agreement that Ingress argues made the Hussein deal void, despite the Arabs knowing full well. The final element in Ingress' argument is the third promise made by the British government only a year later, that being the Balfour Declaration, a pledge that promised support for a national home for the Zionists. Prior to the Hussein deal, Britain, France, and the US were already in talks with Jewish people about setting up a homeland of their own. This meant that they had priority over the Arabs, even though their agreement was later. Ingress further states that the declaration was created not only to appease Britain's allies, the US, Russian, and the Zionists, but to ensure securing control of the territory, specifically the Suez Canal. An argument supported by Meir Verete in the Balfour Declaration and its makers, stating that the principal motive of the Balfour Declaration was to protect Britain's imperial interests. Ingress concludes that Britain's need to protect its interests, the imperial empire, and success in World War I were the sole motivation behind these agreements and policies, and accidentally set in motion the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews. The question of double promising and legitimacy is addressed by Jonathan Schneer in the Balfour Declaration, The Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Similarly to Ingress, Schneer analyses the promises and agreements made between 1916 and 1917, and supports the argument that 1917 was pivotal to the Arab and Jewish deterioration of their relationship. Schneer's narrative is contextualized in relation to World War I and examines the British political and diplomatic attributes that reacted to the changing relations to the Zionists and the Ottoman Empire. He argues that these significant changes resulted in multiple agreements, not as solely a result of duplicity, but of one of desperation as a result of the war effort. Schneer addresses the narrative, arguing that the British were misunderstood by the Arabs in the Hussein correspondences. He further argues that the agreement did not refer to the Arabs having a land in the area that Israel and Palestine currently exist, but in the main Ottoman Empire itself, that being modern-day Turkey. According to Schneer, the Sykes-Picot Agreement did not contradict the promises made to Hussein. Rather, Schneer states that agreement was simply an act of preparation in order to maintain the control of the Middle East region, and as a result, the Arabs believing that they were promised land there. This process that reflected the geopolitics of the time and imperial policies, which saw vested parties dividing lands between themselves. A view supported by Victor Catan in From Coexistence to Conquest, International Law and the Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1891 to 1949, according to Catan, the implementation of secret treaties were integral to diplomacy and a necessity to safeguard national interests. Furthermore, Schneer states issues only arose when the Bolshevik government published the agreement, resulting in dismay and concerns for both the Arabs and the Zionists. However, it was the Zionists that seized the opportunity to persuade the British government to support their aspirations through the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration itself, Schneer argues, was a result of Britain's desperate situation and was capitalized on by the Weizmann scale and persuasion, an agreement supported by Leonard Stein in his survey, the Balfour Declaration 1961. The narrative that Weizmann manipulated the misconceptions and anti-Semitic prejudice held at the time by the ruling parties in Britain, including the Prime Minister Lloyd George, to advance the Zionist agenda. An interpretation of inspiration and biblical deviation was a crucial factor to the creation of the Declaration and is supported by Ronald Sanders' work, The High Walls of Jerusalem. He argues that Lloyd George and Balfour themselves felt obliged and wanted to be associated with returning the Jews to their homeland. In the Bible, Moses famously freed the Jews from Egypt and brought them to the free land that is modern-day Israel. Furthermore, according to Schneer, whilst prophecy influenced, so too did the notion that the Jews allegedly held all the power and political influence worldwide. British politicians believed that and I quote, "the world Jewry was a powerful force which could affect the fortunes of war, and that most Jews were active supporters of Zionism," end quote. An incentive that was beneficial to the war effort by ensuring American capital and the continuation of Russian participation. In exchange, the Zionists would be supported by the British and the Allied nations to establish a national home in Israel. Schneer's central theme that the multiple agreements were created out of desperation is evident in his presentation of further negotiations with other parties. Britain was happy to explore options like the separate peace talks with the Turkish, although they were unsuccessful, and had the Ottoman Empire agreed, then Zionist aspirations would have ended there. Ultimately, the war was instrumental in the creation of divided promises dependent on how well each party was doing and what could be gained from the others. Whilst different circumstances may have presented a different picture, Schneer is conclusive in his argument that the Balfour Declaration was responsible for sowing the seeds of resentment, hatred, suspicion, and discrimination in the Middle East between Arabs and the Jews. The debate surrounding the three wartime agreements is a narrative examined in the work by Friedman, Palestine, a twice-promised land, the British, the Arabs, and Zionism, 1915 to 1920. In contrast to Ingress, Friedman rebukes the interpretation that the British government promised land both to the Arabs and the Jews during World War I. Friedman juxtapositions his argument by deconstructing the viewpoints created by George Antonius and Arnold Toynbee in the Journal of Modern History. Friedman's examination of the Hussein correspondences questioned the promise of Arab independence. He argues that this was never pledged. The correspondences were a wartime agreement that had no status and was conditional to the reciprocal of a successful Arab rebellion against the Turks. A rebellion that was not successful against the Ottoman Empire, and as a result, it was void. Furthermore, Friedman argues that Palestine was never included in a future Arab state, a fact that Hussein and the Arabs were aware of at the time. In addition, Friedman contradicts the narrative that the Arabs were the victim in the multiple agreements. He argues that Hussein was aware of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and as a result did not violate the Hussein correspondences, an argument that is supported by Eddie Kadori. Friedman's interpretation of Hussein's response to the Balfour Declaration in 1917 acknowledges his initial concern. However, Friedman argues that Hussein understood the implication of the agreement, citing the Hogarth report that Hussein, and I quote, agreed enthusiastically, end quote, as a clear indication that he supported the policy and was supported in the Weizmann-Fiesel Agreement of 1919. Friedman concludes that the three pledges were compatible, but they were not duplicity and did not constitute the deterioration of the relationship between the Arabs and the Jews, because, in reality, this did not take place until the late 1920s and 1930s. The question if the early British World War I policies were not the reason for the deterioration, then what were the reasons? Some historians have suggested that the mandate, which was ratified by the League of Nations in 1922 and was implemented in 1923, was far more influential and had a greater impact on the interactions of the Arabs, Jews, and the British. The mandate, which empowered the British government to govern both nations of Israel and Palestine for an unlimited time until a national home for both the Jewish and the Arab people was established, all while the British were to protect the civil and religious rights of both of these people. The British mandate was perhaps doomed from the outset. This is a concluding sentence in the work of Bernard Wasserstein, Wasserstein in his work describes the interaction between the different parties, a theme that is explored in his narrative. He examines the irresolvable implementations carried out for the early part of the mandate. These complexities that were faced by this administration, shaped by the ever-changing policies in order to create a cooperative, binational state for both communities. To quote, "The political structure of mandatory Palestine was founded on the illusion that Britain could somehow discover a method of reconciling Zionist and Arab national interests." End quote. Furthermore, Wasserstein argues that the failures such as the Arabs refusing Herbert Samuel's attempt to create self-governing institutions, the White Papers of 1922, and the unprovoked, sudden, and aggressive Arab riots of 1929 reinforced doubts held by many British diplomats towards the possibility of trying to keep the peace between both sides without any aggression or put-downs. According to Wasserstein, from the military through to the civil officials, Zionism was viewed with some degree of hostility by the Arabs. Wasserstein denounces this stems from anti-Semitism, or obstinance, or injustice, but due to the violent nature of the Arabs themselves residing in the area, and their attempt to target the Jewish religion by trying to block off the Wailing Wall for Israelis. The Wailing Wall, for those who don't know, is one of the most holiest sites considered in the Jewish religion. Very similar to how Mecca is considered the holiest site in Arab religion. So of course, Arabs trying to block the Wailing Wall from the Israelis is obviously going to cause issues. A narrative of misgivings of Zionism is partially supported in Cohen's interpretations. However, he chooses to try and blame the British themselves with very little evidence to support his case. Wasserstein's narrative of the doubts held by many British diplomats in relation to commitments of the mandate are explored through the reactions of the British government, from the Conservatives in the White Paper of 1922, the 1929 riots by the Labour administration, the 1936 Arab riots, and the geopolitical situation that resulted in the 1939 White Paper that sought the revision of the Balfour Declaration. Wasserstein concludes that the failed attempts to implement the mandate as a result of the Arabs resulted in the creation of an unstable political arena and an anti-Semitic view from the Arabs, compromising of separate institutions, increasing the hostilities between the Zionists and the Arabs. Naomi Shepard takes a similar viewpoint by exploring the administrative systems that influenced the inner relationships during the Palestine Mandate. Supporting Wasserstein's theory, she contextualizes her argument in relation to a background of misplaced colonial systems and financial constraints. Shepard analyzes British rule from 1917 to 1948. Pivotal to her argument are the vast differences between the communities, both within the urban and rural context. The integral factors, Shepard argues, were the difficulties in managing the opposing frameworks. Arab politics was centralized around family and religion, whilst Jews' politics were centered around Eastern European politics and socialist theory. These differences in terms of political, linguistically, and culture proved unachievable to legislate, and attempts to elevate this difference often resulted in further resentment. Shepard analyzes the attempts in 1919, 1921, 1923, and in 1935 to reformulate the mandate to reflect the rights for self-determination. The failed attempts by Samuel and Wauchope to create cooperative institutions to share government power were rejected by the Arabs to avoid legitimacy of the declaration, and then refused by the Jews due to proportional representation. Shepard argues even when reinforced policies were introduced, the White Paper of 1922, which imposed restrictions of land purchase and permanent conditions of the immigration of the Jews, that this did little to appease the Arabs and antagonized the Jews. Additionally, the Arabs were offered 75% of their land that would be protected and accepted internationally. However, they rejected this, such as with many other agreements later that would attempt to bring peace to the Arab-Israeli area of the Middle East. Despite Britain assisting the Arabs, their violence and rejections for peace and coexistence antagonize them, not just then, but in years to come. Furthermore, Shepard states that Britain's insurmountable realization that the two nations were incompatible and the increase in violence resulted in the Peel Commission in 1937, which recommended the abandonment of the mandate and the partition of the land into two separate states, a solution accepted by the Jews, but once again rejected by the Arabs. Shepard asserts that Britain was simply faced with an impossible task to implement the mandate due to the complexity of the different parties and the incompatible to reconcile the demands of the Arab nationalism that was present. Interrelations and competing nationalisms between Zionists and Palestinians is a narrative that is explored by Hillel Cohen. In his work, Cohen presents an alternative to the traditional narrative of uncooperating, competing nationalism, and instead discuss the motivation of collaboration during the Mandate years and the profound influence it had on shaping Arab nationalism and Palestine. Like Wasserstein, Cohen depicts the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise in Zionist immigration responsible for the awakening of Palestinian nationalism. According to Cohen, and I quote, "The history of the Palestinian national movement cannot be studied without a thorough examination of collaboration." End quote. Cohen examines the shifts in acceptable collaboration in the mid-1920s as their economic relationship was preserved. However, by 1936, this all fell apart. Cohen states that motivation for collaboration took four forms. Firstly, land sales supplying information for economic advantage, protection of village autonomy due to the fear of national leadership, disbelief of inflexible position towards Zionism, and the belief that cooperation protected the rights of the Palestinians, and finally, personal relationships contradicting the hardline nationalist leadership who viewed all Jews hostile. Cohen is critical of the tactics of al-Husseini in his persecution of rivals, anti-Jewish policies, and terror campaign on so-called traitors, not only glorifying and supporting the Arab revolt in 1936 to 1939, but was instrumental in forcing some Palestinian Arabs closer to the Zionists, which is what many people do not know about. According to Cohen, the internal struggles and competing objectives within the Palestinian society weakened Palestinian nationalism and allowed exploitation by the Zionists. This resulted in many Palestinians becoming accidental collaborators by aiding the intelligence bodies. Overall in his work, Cohen believes clearly that collaboration, whether encouraged by the Zionists or reactivated or motivated by the Palestinian leadership, ultimately intensified the fissures within Palestine society and paradoxically enabling Zionist success. The emergence of Palestinian nationalism is a narrative that historian Anne Mosley-Lesh examines in Arab Politics in Palestine, 1917 to 1939. Like Cohen, she acknowledges the internal disputes between the feuding families and factions that weakened the Palestinians' agenda. Lesh, however, argues that the internal conflicts were not the principal reason for failure, citing external factors. The larger forces at work were responsible. The British mandate that supported the establishment of a Jewish homeland and was supported by the international world. Lesh's examination from 1917 to 1939 focuses on the complexity and dynamics of the Palestinian Arab national movement. Lesh argues, unlike the Zionists, the Palestine politicians lacked diplomatic leverage, and the boycott of establishing a legislative council, initially to avoid legitimizing the Zionist program and later opposing the Zionist opposition, weakened the impact of Arab grievances in terms of the amending of the mandate and halting the expansion of Zionism in the Middle East. Frustration, injustice, and lack of progression made by mobilization from above in relation to diplomatic negotiation saw a shift and the emergence of new political groups and tactics. Politicians looked towards the mobilization from below youths, farmers, and middle classes that were implemented by civil unrest, including the general strike and, as previously mentioned, the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. Violence, Les argues, was the only choice left for Palestinians to promote their cause and be heard. Paradoxically, these actions were counterproductive, resulting in further controls, undermining their position and political credibility, while strengthening the Zionist opposition. In conclusion, Lesh states that by 1939 the Palestinian movement had neither direction nor coercion. The external obstacles resulted in the failure of independence and set in motion the conflict between the two nations. In his work, Rashid Khalidi questions why the Palestinians failed to establish an independent Arab state. Unlike Lesh, Khalidi acknowledges the institutional constraints imposed by the mandate policies that were faced by the Palestinians. However, he contradicts the interpretation that Palestinians were simply, and as he quotes, helpless victims of forces far greater than themselves. End quote. Khalidi's alternative narrative argues that the Palestinians had choices and opportunities. Through analysing the Palestinian national movement, he questions the roles that the leaders played and the decisions and strategies that were chosen. Arguably, Khalidi states the failures of the leadership stems from the inabilities to comprehend and react to the situation that unquestionably led to obstacles that made the objective of self-determination unachievable. Khalidi, however, does negate that the British are to be blamed during the Mandate years, stating that Britain was a neutral bystander and was doing everything in its ability to quell any violence and keep the peace. However, Khalidi argues that the Arabs in Palestine were not bestowed the same geopolitical benefits by the international world in terms of political and economic support as the Zionists were, an inequality that was heightened by the increase of European Jewish settlers after the Holocaust. However, Khalidi acknowledges that the Palestinian leadership failures were mostly responsible. According to Khalidi, the Palestinian elite, through collusion and reliance of negotiating in private, did little to openly oppose the status quo. Furthermore, the reluctance by al-Husseini to mobilize the Palestinians, whether due to a lack of leadership or through fear of his position rendered through their opposition, proved that essentially it was ineffective. Khalidi's criticism of al-Husseini is further examined firstly through his rejection of the 1939 British White Paper, his failure to recognize the political benefits that would have allowed representation and required cooperation between the Zionists and British. In addition, al-Husseini's choice of defiance against the British to support the Nazi regime and the Holocaust did nothing to benefit the Palestinians' cause and alienate them in future years to come. An event that is also portrayed in the work of Michael Cohen, who describes the active commitment to the destruction of the European Jews by the leader of the Palestinian Arabs and other prominent figures within Arab countries. Their activism saw the encouragement of the Nazi regime's execution of the Jews in the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were killed, the blockage of refugees fleeing from Europe, because they wanted to prevent refugees from fleeing from Europe to America and also Britain and various other areas, and additionally, the zealous creation and recruitment of the Muslim Waffen-SS. Yes, this all did happen, and there's a source for it. This going to be linked down below. In conclusion, Khalidi argues the failure to establish a Palestinian statehood was due to the Palestinian leadership's complicity resulting in the inevitability of confrontation between the Zionists and the Palestinians. Whilst historians acknowledge the significance of nationalism, others question the importance of the geopolitics that indirectly and directly impacted on the dynamics of the Arabs and the Zionists. In Daphne Sharfam's work, it specifically centres on the Second World War and the pivotal effects that it had upon the conflict, a period in which Sharfam calls a new Middle East. Crucial to this period, according to Sharfman, was the emergence of new powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, replacing the existing imperialist power of Britain, because after World War II, we got screwed over. In the first section, Sharfam addresses the impact of World War II, the threat of the Axis invasion between 1939 to 1942 that they tried to do against the British, and in the second part, 1943 to 1945, where the threat of the invasion ceased because we were kicking the Germans' ass, and the impact on the Holocaust that it had on relationships in the Middle East. The dynamics of the relationship is highlighted in the uneasy wartime collaboration between the British and the Jewish communities. During the war, the British did not allow any Jews fleeing Europe to immigrate into the area for the time being. Instead, the British governments kept Jewish refugees in Britain itself to avoid civilian losses in the naval war that was far safer. Essentially, they prevented Jewish refugees from traveling to Israel because at war we were at the time Britain was at war with the Italians and the Germans, and they were essentially running amok in the Mediterranean, and to transport them essentially from the Channel to the Bay of Biscay to the Mediterranean to, there's a lot of sinkings and various stuff and U-boat warfare, so of course they couldn't go there. So that's why they were kept in mainland Britain for the remainder of, so pretty much the whole war, before finally being let to Israel. And obviously, as you have a build-up, you essentially have a point where, when you let them to go into Israel, that you're going to have a lot of Jewish refugees. Also, the situation back in Europe of them not going back to their own homes because they weren't allowed also further supports this case, and as a result, more immigration towards Israel from the European Jews. Anyway, moving on. The problematic relationship created from the White Paper of 1939, which restricted Jewish immigration to 15,000 per year for 5 years, and then after that was all down to Arab consent, caused issues. This strained cooperation is supported by Kristen E. Schultz in the Arab-Israeli conflict, who argues the Jewish population, despite the resentment felt towards the British policy, combined forces with Britain and her allies to combat the events both in the Middle East and Europe. There are a lot of rumours going around on TikTok that essentially Palestinians fought during the Second World War for Britain. As I previously mentioned, there was Muslim SS and also the whole support of the actual Nazi regime and the extermination of the Jews by Palestine. So, what would later form the first government of Palestine and the Palestinians, and therefore it proves this whole theory that's going around on TikTok horrifically wrong, and I've got two sources to back that up. One to back up the fact that the Jews supported the British during the war and her allies, and this is being portrayed in media as well, but also additionally the fact that the Muslims were supporters of the Nazi regime and the Waffen SS in the Palestine region. As Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion stated, and I quote, "We shall fight alongside the British army against the Germans as if the anti-Zionist White Paper of 1939 did not exist." End quote. Physical contributions saw more than 130,000 Jews who enlisted into the British army to assist in victory in Europe, something that the Palestinians did not do, as well assisting with intelligence gathering and covert operations throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. In terms of undermining the White Paper, this manifested itself through illegal Jewish immigration into Palestine. The latter setting the British and the Jews on a collision course of political conflicts and hostility throughout the last years of the Mandate and influenced the future of what would be Israel and Palestine. The new post-war internationalism, specifically the Anglo-American relationship, has also been cited as a critical component in placing pressure on the British government and ultimately responsible for the withdrawal of the British from the area. The link between international support for the Zionists coupled with the sympathy of the Holocaust led to the creation of Israel. The involvement of the United States President Harry S. Truman in Palestinian policy and the reliance of American money is an argument that Hourani highlights in A History of the Arab People, in which he argues that American support for the Jewish state were against the views of Britain, who wanted to keep the peace and prevent any future conflicts between the Arabs and the Jews. The international pressure imposed on Britain diplomatically constrained the options open that were available to them to deal with the counterinsurgency efforts against Zionist terrorists that were going on, and due to this they were unable to protect the Palestinian political rights to independence. Britain's position as a result of this became untenable. The effects of the aftermath of the war are explored by Kirsten E. Schultz in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Whilst Schultz agrees that international sympathy directly related to the Holocaust and the USA influence upon the region with supporting the Zionists with the endorsement of the 1942 Biltmore program in the 1944 elections, did play a vital role in the British decision to withdraw. Furthermore, at this point, the world was opposed to the British Empire despite the peace that they had brought, which can be viewed on my video on the British Empire that I previously did as a reference. Schultz cites other reasons for the withdrawal was as a result of the imperial decline that could no longer be sustained economically or politically, the 1946 Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry to end restrictions on immigration to deal with the post-war refugee crisis, and the military strategic required to combat insurgency that were campaigned by the Jewish on the British and the intercommunal tensions between the Arab and the Jews. Furthermore, the Zionist terrorist attack on the King David Hotel that housed British soldiers and Israeli civilians resulted in the final nail in the coffin and the British withdrawal to ensure no British citizens would lose their lives after World War II, because this happened just after the Second World War, and essentially people who were veterans of the Second World War was still going away in foreign lands to die, and this was very, very bad for British policy, especially post-war British policy of, oh Nelly, we won the war but people are still dying. Nuts. As the British government's hands were tied, there was only one option left for them, and that was the withdrawal from both nations by the British themselves. Whilst 30 years of British policymaking towards the Middle East and impact on the relations between Jews and Arabs has been the common historical narrative of Israel and Palestine, the motivation of the withdrawal by the British government and the issue of Palestine's future, being referred to the newly established United Nations, have been the subject of a wide debate. Zionist historiographies view the withdrawal as a ploy to allow the invasion of Arab armies to eradicate the Jewish homeland, a view supported by John Kimcher, as they state that these men were determined, if the British had to leave Palestine, to put no obstacles in the way of the Arabs driving the Jews into the sea, end quote, which would also have a weird sort of sense of future underlinings in that statement just there to a certain phase. Yeah. The Palestinians cited that the British sympathised with the Zionists since the Balfour Declaration, and to aid the creation of a single Jewish state in Palestine. As Khalidi describes, and I quote, given the balance of power inside Palestine, which was crushingly in favour of the Zionists, a fact of which all parties were well aware of, the British withdrawal was an open invitation for a Zionist military takeover of the country. End quote. Whilst historian Avi Shalem argues that Britain pursued neither anti-Arab or anti-Zionist, but a policy to protect Britain's interests and damage limitation that was done towards the empire. Furthermore, Shalim states while there is no consensus as to why the final acts of the mandate were implemented, there is a common assumption that the withdrawal certainly led the two opposing committees into conflict. Following the transfer to the UN, a special committee for Palestine was set up to conduct an inquiry. The conclusion, like previous inquiries, the Peel Commission and the Anglo-American Commission, recognized that both parties had equal legitimacy and that both objectives, like those of 1920s and 1930s, were conflicting. The solution was partition. Whilst the leadership of Palestinians rejected the proposal, the Zionists, however, approved the proposal. And no surprise, as previously mentioned before with the various other agreements that were turned down, this granted Israel protection of its borders that the UN supports to this day. However, because Palestine rejected it, it is why they are not and never viewed as a legitimate state by the United Nations. On the 29th of November 1947, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution for partition of the land into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. Arguably, the outcome of the end of the mandate and the final Palestinian policy of the UN resolution of the partition of the land that granted legitimacy of the creation of Israel and requested the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state did little to resolve the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs. Whilst the resolution was welcomed by the Zionists with the emergence of Israel, for the Palestinians, the resolution was perceived as unjust, the creation of Lebanization, at the expense of the local native majority. Whilst Israel have succeeded, the Palestinians are still awaiting to build their own state, and the conflict remains to this day in the region. There is no doubt that the occupation by the British of this area of the Middle East between 1916 and 1948, alongside the creation of multiple policies, may have influenced the relationship between Arabs and Zionists. While some scholars have stated that British changes in policies were motivated by biases towards either pro-Zionism or pro-Arab Palestine, others have argued that individuals through lobbying had a greater impact in shaping the British policies. Certainly, the numerous policies to address the legitimacies of both Arabs and Jews did little to appease the parties. Britain's politicians did attempt to resolve the conflict in nationalist demands, however, they failed. And whilst Britain's own commitments whether to sustain their interests in other territories or to succeed in the wars did play a factor, geopolitics and nationalism contributed directly, as well as the indirect role of the Holocaust played in the creation of Israel, that inevitably set the two parties onto a collision course. Ultimately, the United Nations, in its ability to devise a workable solution to the conflicting Arab and Jews agendas, resulted in the tension and the conflict that remains ongoing today. However, in pointing the finger of who is to blame, the fault only lies on one. The Palestinians were offered a state in 1936 in the Peel Commission, and they rejected it. They were further offered a state in 1947 in the UN Partition Plan, and they rejected it. They further rejected offers for a state in 1967 after Israel conquered the West Bank, in 2002, and in 2008 when Ayo Amar, and in 2009 when Israel pulled back from Gaza, that would later result in the situation that is currently ongoing today. If Palestine had accepted just one of these offers, not only would they have a geographical advantage over Israel with 75% compared to 25% for Israel, but additionally they would be accepted as a legitimate state by the UN, NATO, and the Western world. It was a matter of pride that resulted in the lack of cooperation from the Palestinians and the fact that despite over 50 Muslim countries existing, they won't let the Jews have one. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this like sort of history video. This is literally like tore apart my vocal cords. Oh my god, it was awful to record. I was so stressed. Yeah, I'm just gonna flex my military history. DB. Suck on that, you left-wing Australian bearded bald bastard. Yeah! I was like, no, not the Admiralty podcast section again, please, no. We already saw that video, OC. No, please. Why? Why did you bring it up? Why did the pair of you debate? I don't know. Anyway, I'm gonna go to bed now. Good night. Hopefully this won't be turned into like World War III in the comment section. Please don't put a jihad on me.